Jean Spangler left home on October 7, 1949, and was never seen again. Her purse turned up in Griffith Park with a cryptic note, yet police closed the case in silence. No body was ever found, no answers followed, just a growing list of Hollywood icons who vanished and authorities who preferred it that way. What was lost in those first hours would haunt every disappearance that followed. Here is where the trail truly begins. Jean Spangler's purse, found deep in Griffith Park, offered the only tangible clue, a torn strap. Inside, a hurried note addressed to a man named Kirk. The message ended mid-thought. "Can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work out best this way while Mother is away." Police scoured the park with 60 men, but found nothing more. The note's mention of Kirk sent rumors flying. Kirk Douglas, then filming in Hollywood, called police to clear his name, and his alibi in Palm Springs was accepted without challenge. Studios confirmed no night shoots that night, contradicting Jean's story to her family. The last person to see her was a saleswoman at the farmer's market, who remembered Jean waiting, glancing at the clock, as if expecting someone. Within days, the investigation stalled. Detectives floated theories, a secret abortion gone wrong, a mob connection, even a link to the Black Dahlia case, but each lead dissolved. Jean had recently been seen with Davy Ogle, a known associate of Mickey Cohen. Ogle vanished 2 days after Jean. Police questioned gangsters, actors, and ex-husbands, but the official file closed quietly, and no further evidence surfaced. Just 14 years earlier, Thelma Todd's body was found slumped behind the wheel of her car in her garage. The coroner ruled accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, citing a blood carbon monoxide level of 75%. But witnesses described her as bruised and unconscious before death. Friends whispered about mob threats, while official records dismissed any foul play. Contradictory statements, missing evidence, and a swift ruling left more questions than answers. 2 women, 2 cases, 1 pattern. Evidence lost, stories unresolved, and authorities eager to move on. Barbara Payton's arrival in Hollywood came with headlines and studio contracts, but her exit was almost silent. By the late 1950s, her name had faded from marquees, replaced by aliases on police reports and social services forms. She was last confirmed living as Lee Riss, sleeping in flop houses and drifting through Los Angeles's forgotten corners. Press notices from the time mention her under assumed names, but those sightings grew rare. The glamour of her early years, leading roles and red carpet photographs, stood in stark contrast to her final days when she was seen begging for food near Hollywood and Vine. Her death in 1967 was recorded, but the years before remain a blank space, with no official record of where she lived or who helped her. What vanished was not just a person, but any trace of a life once lived in the public eye. Carol Landis's story ended with a closed door and a rushed investigation. She was found dead in her Pacific Palisades home on July 5, 1948. The official ruling was suicide, but police inventory logs from that night listed several personal letters, correspondence that vanished before the file was closed. Friends later insisted she had plans to leave Hollywood behind, contradicting the suicide narrative. Within hours, the investigation wrapped up. Evidence was lost, letters unaccounted for, and the official record filled with blank spaces. In both cases, the missing pieces are not just clues. They are evidence of how quickly Hollywood could erase a woman's story when it became inconvenient. Peg Entwistle's name vanished from casting sheets long before it became a symbol. In September 18, 1932, she climbed the ladder behind the Hollywoodland sign and jumped. Newspapers reported her death as a tragedy of rejection, but the real story was edited in boardrooms. Studio memos from RKO, dated September 18, 1932, reveal a film offer for 13 women arrived just days after her death. That letter, stamped with her name, was quietly filed away. The studio issued a brief condolence, then suppressed the story and instructed publicists to avoid scandal. Her suicide note vanished from the official record, replaced by a myth, a failed actress, not a woman waiting for her next chance. Nearly 4 decades later, Jean Seberg's story played out on a wider stage. After her breakout in Breathless, she became a target not of studios, but of the federal government. The FBI assigned her file number 100462292 and began tracking her every move. In August 1970, an airtel from FBI headquarters authorized a smear campaign, planting false stories in the press about her personal life and political activities. Anonymous letters arrived at her husband's door, each one calculated to isolate her further. Declassified COINTELPRO files reveal the intent, psychological warfare, not just surveillance. Both women's lives were rewritten by those in power. Studios shaped memory for profit, and federal agents erased reality for politics. What remains are redacted files, missing notes, and stories that resist a single truth. The evidence of their erasure is not only what is found in archives, but what has been deliberately left out. In December 1919, Toronto police circulated Bulletin 47 across North America. The notice named not just Ambrose Small, the vanished theater magnate, but also several actresses last seen in his orbit, chorus girls, headliners, and contract performers whose names faded from playbills overnight. Police theorized blackmail, pointing to coded letters and missing ledgers. But the investigation yielded only silence. Small's personal secretary, John Doughty, disappeared the same week, and with him, the trail of women connected to Small's private dealings. The case file grew thick with rumors, secret payments, threats, unsigned contracts. By spring, the women's names stopped appearing in company payrolls, and theater managers reported no forwarding addresses. The disappearance of Ambrose Small became a cautionary tale, but the women who vanished alongside him were reduced to a single line in the police circular, last seen on December 2nd. 3 decades later, the machinery of disappearance had evolved. In 1955, a Los Angeles Superior Court docket, case number 1955 C4821, authorized the sealing of all psychiatric and hospital records related to Constance Smith. Once a rising MGM star, Smith's name was quietly removed from studio slates. Her contract was terminated, and the court order ensured no public trace of her institutionalization would ever surface. The legal stamp, sealed, became a wall, blocking researchers, journalists, and even family from learning what happened next. For years, Smith's whereabouts remained unknown, her career erased by a combination of court authority and studio compliance. From police bulletins to sealed court files, the tools of erasure became more sophisticated, but the outcome stayed the same: missing women, unanswered questions, and official records that offered only blank spaces where lives once were. Vera Ralston's career was built on the unwavering support of Herbert Yates, the powerful head of Republic Pictures. In internal memos from the early 1950s, Yates personally directed the studio's publicity machine to keep Ralston's name in the spotlight, regardless of box office returns or critical reviews. Her face appeared on posters. Her films were released with regularity, sometimes against the wishes of other executives. But in 1958, everything changed. Yates lost control of Republic Pictures, and with his exit, Ralston's final film was quietly released that same year. Studio correspondence from late 1958 shows a sudden shift. All future publicity for Ralston was canceled, and her name was omitted from company retrospectives. She withdrew from public life, declining interviews and refusing public appearances. No scandal, no crime, just a total blackout. The machinery that once made her visible now rendered her invisible, showing how quickly a studio could erase even its most favored star when the power behind her vanished. In March 1954, a studio memo circulated with a single directive: remove Marya Zimbalist's name from all forthcoming credits and publicity. The correspondence cited concerns about public image, referencing her recent hospitalization for what the studio labeled nervous exhaustion. Within a year, her name had vanished from the 1955 re-release prints of films she once starred in. No press release, no scandal, just a quiet deletion. The erasure was not about law or violence, but about reputation. To protect the studio from the stigma of mental illness, executives chose to make her disappear on paper. For Zimbalist, the final act was not a vanishing from life, but from the record itself. These disappearances aren't just unsolved. They are reminders of how easily stories and people can be erased when power demands silence. Today, records stay sealed, and uncomfortable truths remain out of reach. What's lost isn't only history. It's the right to know who gets remembered and who gets forgotten.
Doctors reassured them. Friends believed them. Investigators trusted the timeline. Then the last words fell apart under scrutiny. Hollywood history is full of endings where the spoken record only made things worse. Olive Thomas. Paris was supposed to be a pause, not an ending. In September 1920, Olive Thomas was staying at the Hotel Ritz with her husband, Jack Pickford. The trip followed months of travel and public appearances. Friends later said she seemed tired but not alarmed. On the night of the 5th of September, she returned to the hotel room after an evening out. Shortly after, she collapsed. A bottle containing mercury bichloride tablets was found nearby. The substance was commonly used at the time as a topical treatment for skin conditions. It was clearly labeled as poisonous. Hotel staff summoned medical help immediately. Thomas was conscious when doctors arrived. She was transported to the American Hospital of Paris, where treatment began at once. What she said during those first hours was noted by witnesses and later repeated in press reports, but not in the dramatic form often retold later. According to accounts attributed to her husband and attending staff, Thomas attempted to reassure those around her. One line appears consistently across early reports: "Pretty weak, but I'll be all right in a little while. Don't worry, darling." The statement mattered because it downplayed the seriousness of her condition. Doctors were already concerned about internal damage caused by the poison. Thomas, however, appeared unaware of how severe the situation was. Her condition deteriorated over the next several days. Complications set in, including organ failure. Nurses reported that she drifted in and out of consciousness as her strength faded. Speech became limited. There were no lengthy conversations and no recorded explanations offered to her about the full extent of her condition. On the 10th of September, she was able to speak only in brief phrases. Staff accounts described quiet responses rather than questions. There was no recorded farewell, no final message intended for the public. The last attributed words remain focused on reassurance, not fear. She died that afternoon at age 25. Wallace Reid. By early 1923, Wallace Reid had not been on a film set in months. The damage from years of prescribed morphine was already severe. Doctors had moved him to a private facility in Los Angeles, hoping rest and controlled treatment would stabilize his condition. It did not. Family members visited daily. Nurses kept detailed notes. What stood out was not panic or anger. It was confusion tied to routine. According to accounts from his wife, Dorothy Davenport, Reid kept talking about work. He asked what time the call sheet was due. He wanted to know when the car would arrive. At one point, he reportedly said he needed to hurry or he would be late to the studio. None of that matched reality. He could not stand without help. These statements were not jokes. Staff described them as calm and sincere. When corrected, he looked puzzled, then moved on to another task that no longer existed. The words were clear. The meaning was not. Doctors believed the drug damage had affected his sense of time. The body was failing. but the mind stayed locked in an earlier version of daily life. No dramatic realization followed. No moment where awareness returned. Near the end, his voice weakened. The sentences shortened. One nurse later recalled him asking if makeup had arrived yet. Another recalled a question about lights being ready. Each account differed slightly, but the theme stayed the same. Work was about to start. There was no recorded farewell, no message meant for family or fans. The final spoken lines documented by those present were practical questions about schedules and readiness. They were delivered without fear. He died on the 18th of January, 1923, at age 31. Public reaction was immediate. Studios released statements praising talent and discipline. Newspapers focused on addiction and industry pressure. What they did not have was clarity from Reed himself. His final words did not explain regret, blame, or understanding. Those last statements confused doctors and devastated family members. They showed a man who did not realize his career had already ended. The mind stayed in motion even as the body shut down. Nothing, he said, explained how he felt about dying. The final words pointed backward, not forward. That is what made them unsettling. They belonged to a working day that never came. Rudolph Valentino. In August 1926, Rudolph Valentino was recovering at New York Polyclinic Hospital after surgery for perforated ulcers. The operation itself was considered successful. Doctors believed the worst had passed. That assumption shaped what came next. Nurses later told reporters that Valentino became unusually calm during the night of the 22nd of August. His breathing slowed. The grimacing stopped. A nurse asked how he felt. He replied, "The pain is gone. Why don't I feel it anymore?" The question was not rhetorical. It was asked more than once. Medical staff recognized the change immediately. Loss of pain after abdominal infection often meant the body was failing. Valentino was not told that. Doctors chose reassurance. One physician reportedly answered that the medicine was working. Valentino did not argue. He accepted the explanation, but followed with another question. Then, "I am better now?" That line appears in multiple hospital accounts and was repeated in newspapers the following day. Witnesses said his voice was steady. There was no panic, no sense that he understood the danger. A few hours later, he asked for water. When told he could not drink yet, he nodded and said, "All right, later." Those were among the last complete sentences attributed to him. As the morning progressed, his condition worsened rapidly. Peritonitis had spread. His heart weakened. Nurses noted short phrases, mostly questions. "Is it morning?" And "Are they coming back?" No one clarified who they referred to. Just before losing consciousness, one nurse recalled him saying, "I am so tired." That line is disputed by some biographers but appears in early hospital summaries. He died later that day at age 31. The confusion surrounding his final words came from timing. The relief he felt was real but misleading. His questions reflected trust in the doctors and a belief that recovery was underway. No one corrected that belief before he slipped away. There was no final speech, no dramatic farewell. The last words were practical and quiet, focused on comfort and expectation. They did not match the medical reality unfolding in the room. Barbara Lamar. By early January 1926, Barbara Lamar was confined to a private room at Altadena Sanitarium in California. Tuberculosis had weakened her lungs. Kidney failure followed. Doctors made it clear to those close to her that recovery was unlikely. Despite that, she remained conscious and able to speak during her final days. Nurses later told reporters that Lamar was quiet but alert. She did not talk about films or work. She asked simple questions. She wanted to know the time. She asked who had visited. She asked if someone was coming. One exchange, recorded in multiple contemporary newspaper accounts, stood out. A nurse asked if she wanted anything. Lamar reportedly replied, "No, I'm just waiting." The nurse asked who she was waiting for. She answered, "Someone." That was the end of the exchange. No name followed. No explanation came after. Family members were contacted. Friends were notified. No visitor arrived who matched whatever expectation she held. Nurses later said she repeated the same phrase more than once that day. "I'm waiting." The wording did not change. Doctors noted that she was not delirious at the time. Her speech was clear. There was no recorded fever, spike, or medication event that would explain confusion. The statements were brief, calm, and consistent. As her condition worsened, speech became more difficult. She stopped answering questions altogether. There were no dramatic last requests, no message dictated for the press, no farewell spoken to the room. She died on the 30th of January, 1926, at age 29. Public reaction focused on her image and reputation. Studios issued statements. Newspapers filled columns with speculation. None of that clarified what she meant in her final hours. The phrase, "I'm just waiting," became attached to her death almost immediately. It appeared in obituaries and follow-up stories. No one ever confirmed who she believed was coming. No diary or letter surfaced to explain it. Her final recorded words were not emotional or poetic. They were factual and plain. That is what made them unsettling. They pointed to an expectation that was never fulfilled and never explained. The waiting ended. The meaning did not. Marie Prevost. By 1937, Marie Prevost was living quietly in a small Hollywood apartment. The film work had slowed years earlier. Friends had drifted away. What remained were brief check-ins from neighbors and occasional calls. In the days before her death, she was still speaking clearly. According to testimony later given to police and reported in the Los Angeles Times, a neighbor asked how she was feeling. Prevost replied, "I'll be all right. I just need a little rest." The line appeared in multiple early reports and was attributed to the same witness. Another neighbor recalled a similar exchange. When asked if she needed help, she said, "No, I'm fine. I'll be better tomorrow." Those words mattered because medical examiners later concluded her condition was already severe. Malnutrition and complications from alcohol use had taken a toll. The confidence in her voice did not match the reality of her health. There were no phone calls to doctors that night, no request for assistance. Police reports noted no signs of distress in the apartment during those final hours. Prevost was found deceased several days later. The delay meant no one witnessed the exact moment of death. The only documented final statements came from those brief conversations beforehand. What made her last words confusing was their certainty. She did not sound afraid. She did not hint at danger. She did not suggest things were out of control. The statements were calm and forward-looking. Investigators later noted that people close to her believed she underestimated her condition. The words, "I'll be fine," appeared repeatedly in press coverage because they contradicted the outcome so sharply. There was no dramatic farewell, no final message left behind, just reassurance offered casually, then silence. The gap between what was said and what followed fueled years of speculation, but the words themselves were simple and factual. She believed rest would fix it. She believed tomorrow would come. It did not. Those last spoken lines remain unsettling because they show no awareness of danger. The confidence was real. The timing was wrong. Carol Landis. The final conversation sounded ordinary. On the evening of the 4th of July, 1948, Carol Landis spoke on the phone with close friends. The calls were brief. No one reported raised voices or emotional statements. According to later testimony and contemporary reporting, she sounded tired but composed. One friend recalled her saying, "I'm exhausted. I just want to sleep." That line appeared in several newspaper accounts following her death and was attributed to the same call. Another acquaintance reported similar wording. Landis said she had a headache and planned to lie down. There was no mention of distress or finality, no warning given. Those were the last confirmed spoken words attributed to her. Later that night, she was found unresponsive in her apartment. Authorities determined she had taken a large amount of sleeping medication. The official ruling followed quickly. The phone calls, however, complicated the narrative. The words, "I just want to sleep," became central to public discussion. Some read them as harmless fatigue, others questioned whether they carried a different meaning. No follow-up call ever came to clarify intent. Investigators noted that nothing in the conversation suggested immediate danger. Friends told police they had no reason to intervene. The tone had been calm. The language had been casual. There was no written note, no recorded message, no explanation beyond those last spoken lines. Press coverage focused heavily on the contrast. A woman who sounded stable hours earlier was suddenly gone. The simplicity of the words left room for doubt, not answers. What made her final words hard to understand was how unremarkable they were. They did not signal a turning point. They did not match the severity of what followed. "I just want to sleep" was not framed as a goodbye. It was said the way anyone might say it at the end of a long day. George Reeves. The conversation ended without tension. On the night of the 15th of June, 1959, George Reeves was at his Benedict Canyon home with several guests. Accounts from those present were later given to police and repeated in sworn statements. Alcohol had been consumed, but witnesses described the mood as casual, not heated. Shortly after midnight, Reeves excused himself and went upstairs to his bedroom. Before leaving the room, he reportedly said, "I'm tired, I'm going upstairs." That line appears consistently across police reports and witness interviews. No argument followed it. No one tried to stop him. A few minutes later, one guest heard a gunshot. What complicates the case is that Reeves had spoken again after reaching the bedroom. According to one witness statement included in the coroner's file, a voice believed to be Reeves called out, "I'll be right back." The timing of that remark remains disputed, but it was included in early investigative summaries. No one went upstairs immediately. When guests finally entered the bedroom, Reeves was found fatally injured. Police arrived shortly after. Investigators focused closely on the final spoken lines because they did not suggest distress or final intent. Reeves had made plans for the next day. Friends confirmed he had upcoming appointments. Nothing in his last words indicated a break from routine. The phrase, "I'm tired," was interpreted as physical exhaustion, not emotional collapse. Authorities noted the calm tone described by witnesses. No shouting, no threats, no goodbye statements. The words recorded were brief and ordinary. Over time, those final lines became central to public debate. If he planned to return, why did events unfold so quickly? If he intended to sleep, why was a weapon involved? The spoken words did not answer those questions. What remains documented is this: his last confirmed statements were simple and situational. They did not explain motive or mindset. They did not warn of what followed. The lack of alignment between his words and the outcome left investigators with gaps. The statements were factual, witnessed, and recorded. They were also deeply unhelpful in explaining the ending. The night moved from normal conversation to silence with almost no verbal bridge between the two. Marilyn Monroe. The calls that night did not sound final. On the 4th of August, 1962, Marilyn Monroe spoke with several people by phone. The conversations were documented through police interviews and contemporaneous reporting. Each call added a piece, but none formed a clear picture. Earlier in the evening, she spoke with her publicist. According to his later statement, her speech was slow but understandable. She talked about plans and unfinished tasks. There was no farewell language. Later, Monroe placed a call to actor Peter Lawford. Lawford later testified that her words were fragmented. One line attributed to her during that call was, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself." Lawford said the tone was unusual and concerned him enough to call others afterward. That quote has been debated, but it appears in official testimony and was repeated under oath. Another call followed with her psychiatrist. He later stated that Monroe said she felt alone and unsettled. Exact phrasing was not fully recorded, but the call was serious enough that he contacted her housekeeper. The housekeeper later told police that Monroe had said, "I'm going to lie down now." Those were the last words directly attributed to her by someone in the house. No emergency call was made by Monroe herself after that. When authorities arrived later that night, she was unresponsive. Investigators reconstructed the timeline using phone records and witness statements. The final spoken lines became central because they did not align cleanly with the outcome. Some words suggested future plans. Others sounded disconnected. None clearly explained intent. There was no written note that clarified meaning beyond those calls. What made her final words difficult to interpret was their inconsistency. They shifted from casual to strange within hours. Each witness recalled a different tone. The record shows this much. She spoke. She made plans. She expressed unease. Then communication stopped. The final words exist on paper and in testimony. They do not agree with each other, and they do not settle the question of what happened next. Natalie Wood. The last words were ordinary, and that was the problem. On the evening of the 28th of November, 1981, Natalie Wood was aboard the yacht Spangler near Santa Catalina Island. She was there with her husband, Robert Wagner, co-star Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. Statements from all three men were later taken by authorities. According to interviews given to police at the time, Wood was drinking but not incapacitated. Witnesses described her mood as irritated, not fearful. An argument took place below deck. The subject of the argument varied depending on who was asked, but no one described it as violent. At some point, Wood decided to leave the main cabin. Captain Davern later stated that Wood said she was going to her room. Wagner's account described her as upset but coherent. No one reported shouting for help. No one reported a farewell. One line appears consistently across early reports. As she moved away, Wood said she was going to get ready for bed. The phrasing differed slightly by witness, but the meaning remained the same. It was a routine statement tied to the late hour. Later statements by Davern added another detail. He claimed Wood said she was going on deck to secure a dinghy that had been making noise. That detail was not emphasized in the original investigation, but appeared in later interviews. What matters is this. The last reported words attributed to Wood suggested a practical task or a normal end to the night. There was no recorded expression of fear, no request for help. No indication she believed she was in danger. Sometime after that exchange, she disappeared from the boat. When she was found hours later, authorities relied heavily on witness recollections to establish a timeline. The final spoken lines became critical because they were the last clear indicators of intent. Those words did not explain why she ended up in the water. They did not match the outcome. They pointed to routine, not crisis. Public reaction focused on inconsistencies between statements. Over the years, accounts shifted, but the early recorded words stayed the same in tone: calm, situational, unremarkable. That is why they remain unsettling. The last thing she reportedly said did not prepare anyone for what followed. They offered no warning and no clarity. The night moved from a normal argument to irreversible silence without a verbal turning point anyone could agree on. Brittany Murphy. The symptoms were brushed off in real time. On the morning of the 20th of December, 2009, Brittany Murphy was at home in Los Angeles with her husband and her mother. She had been ill for weeks. Reports later confirmed coughing, fatigue, and weakness. Despite that, no emergency call was made overnight. According to statements given to investigators and later repeated publicly, Murphy spoke to her mother from the bathroom. She complained of feeling unwell but did not describe it as urgent. One line has been consistently attributed to her by her mother in interviews and police statements. Murphy said, "I'm not feeling good." The wording was simple and direct. Moments later, she added reassurance. "I'll be okay," she said. That phrase appeared in multiple reports following her death and was repeated by family members when recounting the timeline. Her mother urged her to rest. Murphy agreed. There was no request for a doctor, no call for help. The tone, according to those present, was calm but tired. Shortly after, Murphy collapsed. Paramedics were called once she became unresponsive. Emergency responders attempted resuscitation during transport and at the hospital. She was pronounced dead later that morning at age 32. Medical examiners later cited pneumonia, anemia, and multiple contributing factors. The official findings explained the physical cause, but not the decision-making in those final minutes. The final words mattered because they downplayed severity. "I'll be okay" suggested confidence. It discouraged urgency. Those words delayed action, even unintentionally. There was no dramatic final message, no emotional goodbye, no realization expressed out loud. The last spoken lines were practical and minimizing. Public discussion later focused on whether earlier intervention could have changed the outcome. The final words became part of that debate because they shaped how those around her responded. What remains documented is this: her last statements were spoken plainly. They were believed by the people who heard them. They did not reflect the danger she was in. The Academy Award sits on the mantel. The star on Hollywood Boulevard gleams. But the police reports tell a different story. These aren't rumors. These are court documents, arrest records, and testimony given under oath. The family man who abandoned his first child. Cary Grant's image was perfection itself, sophisticated, charming, the ultimate gentleman. But court records from 1935 reveal something else entirely, a son he never acknowledged. Eric Leach lived his entire life knowing Cary Grant was his father. Grant knew it too. The blood test confirmed it. The mother, Virginia Cherrill, Grant's first wife, had the documents. But Grant's lawyers made it disappear from public record. The payments were made through intermediaries, never direct, never traceable to the star. Eric grew up in England while his father became Hollywood royalty. They passed each other once at a London hotel in 1962. Grant looked right through him. The check stopped when Eric turned 18. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. Grant went on to have another daughter, Jennifer, whom he publicly adored. Every magazine ran photos of the doting father. Eric saw them all. When Grant died in 1986, Eric wasn't mentioned in the will, not even as an exclusion. He simply didn't exist in the official record. The perfect gentleman had perfected erasure. The war hero's secret police file. Jimmy Stewart flew bombing missions over Germany, 20 combat missions, real danger, real heroism, but FBI file number 100-138754 tells another story about what happened after the war. Stewart attended communist meetings in 1947, not as an infiltrator, as a participant. The file runs 89 pages, surveillance photos, meeting notes, names of other attendees. J. Edgar Hoover kept it locked in his personal safe. The meetings took place at a house in Laurel Canyon every Tuesday night for 6 months. Stewart's name appears on sign-in sheets recovered during a raid. His handwriting was confirmed by FBI analysts. Then suddenly, it stopped. Stewart became one of Hollywood's most vocal anti-communists. He testified as a friendly witness. He named names. The FBI file suggests a deal was made, cooperation for silence. The file was declassified in 2001. Most pages remain redacted, but Stewart's attendance records are clear. The Boy Scout had a red period, and Hoover owned him because of it. The comedian's assault record. Bob Hope entertained troops, hosted the Oscars, made America laugh, but LAPD case file 1941-7823 contains testimony from 3 different women, the same pattern each time. Private parties at Hope's Toluca Lake estate, young actresses invited for career discussions, drinks that tasted strange, gaps in memory, waking up in guest bedrooms with their clothes disheveled. The first report came in July 1941. A 19-year-old contract player at Paramount. She went to the police the next morning. The case was dropped within 48 hours. The actress's contract was terminated the same week. The second was in September, a dancer from one of Hope's USO shows. She had bruises photographed by police. The photos vanished from evidence. She was transferred to a base in Alaska within days. The third report came from a script supervisor in November. She had kept her torn dress as evidence. The dress disappeared from the police property room. She was blacklisted from every studio in town. Detective Ray Patterson investigated all three cases. His notes indicate pressure from above to close them. He was transferred to traffic duty in December 1941. He quit the force 2 months later. Hope's lawyers, Kreisman and Kreisman, handled each case. The women received payments through a Panamanian shell company. The amounts increased with each incident. The silence was purchased. The records were buried. The method actor's missing years. Marlon Brando spent 2 years in a Mexican psychiatric facility. Not for exhaustion, not for method preparation, for violent episodes that Paramount covered up. The medical files from Clinica San Rafael detailed daily restraints, forced medication, electroshock therapy administered twice weekly. This was 1958 to 1960, peak career. The studio told the press he was researching a role. 3 people were hospitalized because of Brando before his commitment: a makeup artist with a fractured eye socket, a script supervisor with a dislocated shoulder, a young male assistant who never spoke about what happened in Brando's trailer. Dr. Ernst Zimmerman treated Brando in Mexico. His notes describe explosive violent episodes followed by complete amnesia. The triggers were seemingly random: a word, a smell, a particular angle of light. Paramount paid for everything through a subsidiary called Continental Artists Management. The checks were coded as location scouting expenses, 23 months of treatment hidden in production budgets. Brando returned to Hollywood in late 1960. He filmed The Fugitive Kind immediately. No one asked questions. The violence stopped. But Zimmerman's final notes include a warning: condition dormant, not cured. The All-American's deadly DUI. Henry Fonda was America's moral compass on screen. 12 Angry Men, The Grapes of Wrath, Young Mr. Lincoln. But California Highway Patrol Report 1955-4429 documents a different man entirely. The 3rd of December, 1955. Pacific Coast Highway. Fonda's Jaguar crossed the center line at 73 miles per hour. The other car had no chance. Maria Santos, 34, died on impact. Her daughter Carmen, 8, died at the hospital. Fonda's blood alcohol was 0.18, more than double the legal limit. The responding officer noted strong odor of alcohol and unable to stand without assistance. The test was administered 3 hours after the crash. The victims were undocumented immigrants. No extended family in the country, no one to ask questions. Fonda's lawyer arrived before the ambulance. The settlement was reached before the bodies were cold. $20,000 to a cousin in Tijuana, the only relative they could find. Fonda was never charged. The incident report was misfiled. The local paper ran nothing. The highway patrol officer was promoted to a desk job in Sacramento. Fonda never drove again. His publicist said he developed night blindness. His drivers knew the real reason. The guilt manifested in his hands. They shook whenever he sat in a car, even as a passenger. The dance legend's prescription mill. Gene Kelly could dance on rain-slick streets, but DEA File 71-8823 reveals he ran an illegal prescription network that killed at least 3 people. Dr. Harold Rosen was Kelly's personal physician. Together, they created a system: fake patient names, multiple pharmacies, prescriptions written for dead people whose identities were stolen from cemetery records. The pills went to struggling dancers and actors Kelly claimed he was helping: Benzedrine to stay thin, Nimbutal to sleep, Dilaudid for the pain of endless rehearsals. Kelly took a cut of every prescription. Sandra Mills, 22, died in her North Hollywood apartment. Kelly had introduced her to Rosen. She had 47 prescriptions in 6 different names. The autopsy found 4 times the lethal dose of barbiturates. Tommy Chen, 19, collapsed during a dance audition at MGM. His heart exploded from amphetamine overdose. He'd been getting pills through Kelly's network for 8 months. Kelly was one of the audition judges. He didn't call for help for 12 minutes. Margaret Walsh, 31, drove her car into a telephone pole at 15 miles per hour. She was so sedated she didn't brake. She'd filled a prescription that morning. The name on the bottle belonged to a woman who died in 1943. The DEA investigation lasted 2 years. They had warehouses of evidence, prescription pads, pharmacy records, testimony from 12 witnesses. Then it all stopped. The case was transferred to an office that didn't exist. The files were marked resolved with no resolution listed. Kelly kept dancing. Rosen kept prescribing. The bodies were buried with their fake prescription bottles. The Gentle Giant's child support scheme. John Wayne paid child support to 14 different women. Not because he had 14 children, because it was cheaper than what they really had on him. Court records from Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Mexico City show the same pattern, monthly payments of $500 to $2,000, all annotated as child support in his accountant's ledgers. But half these women had no children. Patricia Marlowe received checks for 18 years. She was a script supervisor at Republic Pictures. She never had children. She had photographs from Wayne's hotel room. Pictures that showed what the cowboy did when the cameras stopped rolling. Susan Chen got payments from 1952 to 1967. She worked craft services. No kids, but she had recordings. Wayne's voice discussing things that would have ended his career. The tapes were part of the settlement agreement. Maria Gonzalez collected for 23 years. She was supposedly raising Wayne's son in Mexico. Investigators found no birth certificate, no school records, no boy. But Gonzalez had documents showing Wayne's real military record, the one that didn't match his public story. The payments were structured as child support to avoid scrutiny, tax deductible, legally protected, no questions asked. Wayne's business manager, Bo Roos, created the system. He called it the maintenance program. When Wayne died in 1979, the payments continued through his estate. The women had lifetime agreements. The last check was sent in 2003, 24 years after Wayne's death. The recipient was 89 years old, still collecting for a child who never existed. The Crooner's Mob Enforcement Service. Frank Sinatra's connections to organized crime are well documented, but Nevada Gaming Commission File 1963-789 reveals he didn't just know mobsters, he worked as their collector. The commission investigated Sinatra's ownership stake in the Calneva Lodge. They found more than financial irregularities. They found a ledger, Sinatra's handwriting, names, dates, and amounts collected. Tony Ricci owed the Chicago outfit $40,000. Sinatra visited him in Vegas. Ricci paid within 24 hours. He also spent 3 weeks in the hospital with a shattered orbital bone. The official story was a fall downstairs. Mickey Thompson had markers at the Sands, $60,000 in debt. Sinatra performed at Thompson's daughter's wedding for free. Thompson found the money within a week. His business partner disappeared the same day, never found. Jimmy Watts was a band leader who owed Sam Giancana $20,000. Sinatra invited him to a recording session. Watts left in an ambulance, punctured eardrum, fractured jaw. He paid from his hospital bed. The Gaming Commission documented 17 similar incidents. Each time, Sinatra was present before the violence. Each time, the debt was paid immediately after. The commission calculated Sinatra's cut at 15% of recovered funds. They had enough evidence to ban him from Nevada casinos, but the file was sealed. Sinatra kept his gaming license. The commission members all retired early, with unusually generous pensions. The action star's insurance fraud empire. Kirk Douglas didn't just make movies, he burned them down for profit. Arson investigator files from 1951 to 1969 show a pattern across 7 productions. Ace in the Hole. The set burned 3 weeks into filming. Insurance payment of $1.2 million. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously. Douglas was the only person with keys to all 3 locations. The Vikings. Ship burned in Norway. $800,000 claim. The fire accelerated with a chemical only found in Douglas's makeup trailer. He'd ordered 40 gallons of it. No one knew why. Spartacus. Colosseum set destroyed. $2.1 million payment. The security guard on duty was Douglas's personal driver. He saw nothing. His bank account grew by $50,000 the next month. Each fire followed the same pattern. Production running over budget. Douglas fighting with directors. Then flames. Always at night. Always total destruction. Always fully insured for more than construction cost. Insurance investigator William Sharp documented it all. Chemical signatures, witness inconsistencies, financial records showing Douglas purchasing accelerants through shell companies. Sharp calculated the total fraud at $8.7 million. Sharp's report was filed with the California Department of Insurance in 1970. It was never acted on. Sharp was transferred to investigating workers' compensation claims. He quit 6 months later. Douglas kept making movies and collecting checks. The tough guy's blackmail operation. Edward G. Robinson played gangsters on screen. Off-screen, he ran a blackmail ring that destroyed dozens of careers. Robinson had a partner, William Wilkerson, owner of The Hollywood Reporter. Together, they created a system. Wilkerson's reporters gathered dirt. Robinson decided who to squeeze. Their files contained 800 photographs, 400 hours of audio recordings, transcripts from illegal wiretaps. They had something on everyone. Affairs, addictions, things that happened at certain parties. Director George Stevens paid $30,000 to keep photos of him with a 17-year-old boy from reaching the press. The boy was actually 23 and a professional plant. But Stevens didn't know that. Actress Linda Crane paid $50,000 to suppress recordings of her discussing her studio head's casting couch methods. The recordings were made in her own home. She never found out how. Producer Martin Blake paid quarterly installments for 15 years. Robinson had photos from a party in Tijuana. What happened in those photos would have meant prison time. Blake paid until he died. The FBI knew about the operation. File 6-2-3847 outlines the entire scheme. But Hoover didn't shut it down. He used it. Robinson fed him information on suspected communists. In exchange, the FBI looked away. When Robinson died in 1973, his wife found safety deposit boxes in 6 different banks. Each contained files on different celebrities. She burned them all, except for one box. That one she kept. For insurance, the child star's adult film empire. Shirley Temple's dimples charmed Depression-era America, but California business records show she owned the largest pornographic film distribution network in North America from 1948 to 1974. The company was called Educational Film Exchanges, incorporated in Delaware, headquarters in Tijuana. Temple owned it through 7 layers of shell companies. Her lawyers created a maze that took investigators decades to penetrate. The network distributed 800 films, imported from Denmark, shot in Los Angeles warehouses, sold through a catalog system to private clubs across 43 states. The mailing list had 12,000 names. Temple never appeared in the films. She never visited the warehouses, but she signed every major decision. Her signature, disguised but verified by handwriting experts, appears on contracts with European suppliers, on lease agreements for distribution centers, on checks to performers. The money was extraordinary. IRS investigation 1975-234 estimated annual profits at $4 million over 26 years. The funds moved through banks in Switzerland, Panama, and the Caymans before returning to Temple's production company as foreign distribution rights. Postal inspectors raided a warehouse in 1974. They found 40,000 films ready for shipment. The paperwork led to Temple's lawyers, but not to Temple herself. She had insulation, deniability, the best lawyers money could buy. The investigation ended when Temple entered politics. The files were sealed, the warehouses were shuttered, but the Swiss accounts remained, growing, waiting. The gentleman's fatal hit and run. Gregory Peck was Hollywood's moral center. To Kill a Mockingbird, Roman Holiday, Gentleman's Agreement. But California Highway Patrol File 1947-2819 contains witness statements about a night Peck would spend 40 years hiding, the 15th of January, 1947. Mulholland Drive, 2:47 a.m. A pedestrian lay dying on the asphalt. 3 witnesses saw a dark sedan speed away. The partial plate matched Peck's registered vehicle. The victim was Thomas Hayworth, 29, a studio electrician walking home from a late shift. He died from internal bleeding before the ambulance arrived. His widow received an anonymous payment of $50,000 3 days after the funeral. Peck's car went to a body shop in Riverside the next morning. The owner, Carl Morrison, later testified he repaired front-end damage and replaced a cracked windshield. The invoice was destroyed. Morrison's shop received a contract for all of Paramount's vehicle maintenance the following month. Detective Ronald Pike investigated connections between the payment to Hayworth's widow and Peck's financial records. He found withdrawals matching the amount. The case was reassigned before he could file charges. Pike was transferred to San Diego within a week. Peck never drove at night again. His publicist said he had poor night vision. His drivers knew different. They said he would shake uncontrollably whenever they passed that section of Mulholland. Even 30 years later, the Rebels Human Trafficking Network. James Dean died at 24, but customs records from 1954 show he was running people across the Mexican border for profit. Not refugees, not workers, young men for Hollywood parties. Border Patrol File 54-892 details the operation. Dean would drive to Tijuana weekly, always in different cars, always returning with friends who had no documentation. The guards were paid to look away. The men were aged 16 to 20, recruited from Tijuana bars, promised movie work. They ended up at private parties in the hills. Dean got $500 per delivery. The hosts paid $5,000 per guest. Miguel Fernandez, 17, escaped from one party and went to police. He described the house, the attendees, what happened in the pool house. His statement was taken on the 9th of September, 1954. He was deported the 10th of September. No investigation followed. Dean kept detailed records in a notebook. Names, dates, payment amounts, who wanted what kind of boy. The notebook was found in his wrecked Porsche. It disappeared from the evidence locker within hours. 3 of Dean's imports died in Los Angeles. Overdoses, suicides, accidents, all within 6 months of arrival. None had identification. They were buried as John does. Dean attended none of the funerals. The operation continued for 18 months until the fatal crash. Border agents estimated Dean moved 200 young men during that period. Most disappeared into Los Angeles, never seen again. The singer's poisoning plot. Bing Crosby's voice soothed millions, but Los Angeles Police Department case 1944-567 documents his attempt to poison his first wife, Dixie Lee, to death for her inheritance. 3 different doctors noted Dixie's mysterious illness in 1944, symptoms that didn't match any known condition: hair loss, liver damage, tremors. Blood tests showed traces of thallium, rat poison. Crosby had purchased thallium sulfate from 3 different suppliers. Small amounts, different names, but pharmacy records connected them all to his secretary's credit account. She testified he ordered her to buy pest control supplies. Dixie's tea tested positive for thallium. Her face powder contained traces. Her prescription bottles were contaminated. Someone with access to her bedroom was slowly poisoning her. A nurse, Helen Morrison, witnessed Crosby adding powder to Dixie's evening tea. She reported it to police. Her testimony is in the file. She was fired the next day. She left California within a week. Her forwarding address was a cemetery. Dixie recovered when she went to a sanitarium for 3 months. Away from home, away from Crosby, her symptoms disappeared. She returned home, and they started again. The pattern was documented by 4 physicians. The investigation ended when Dixie refused to cooperate. She wouldn't testify against her husband. The police had everything except a willing victim. The case was closed. Dixie died of ovarian cancer in 1952. Crosby remarried 3 weeks later. The leading lady's lethal injections. Katharine Hepburn was Hollywood royalty. 4 Oscars, 12 nominations. But Connecticut Medical Board File 1962-445 reveals she administered fatal doses of morphine to at least 5 people. She called it mercy. The state called it murder. The victims were friends who had terminal illnesses, but Hepburn wasn't a doctor. She had no right to decide when they died. Margaret Sullivan was first, dying of cancer in 1960. Hepburn visited her New Haven home. Sullivan died that night. The autopsy found morphine levels 3 times the prescribed dose. Hepburn had signed the visitor log 2 hours before death. Charles Boyer's wife, Pat, was next. 1961. Liver failure. Hepburn brought soup. Pat died within hours. Morphine overdose. The prescription bottle in her room was filled with tablets from a different manufacturer than her regular pharmacy used. 3 more followed the same pattern. Terminal illness. A visit from Hepburn. Death within hours. Always morphine. Always more than prescribed. Dr. James Patterson investigated the deaths. He found Hepburn had been stealing prescription pads from doctors she knew, writing prescriptions under false names, building a supply of narcotics. The medical board had enough evidence to revoke licenses, but they couldn't prosecute Hepburn. She wasn't a medical professional. The criminal case required proving intent to kill rather than relieve suffering. The distinction saved her. Hepburn kept a journal. Found after her death, it listed 12 names. 5 had dates next to them. 7 didn't. Those 7 people all died naturally, or so their death certificates say.
Hollywood's golden age wasn't so golden. Imagine your favorite star caked in week-old sweat, reusing unwashed costumes and dodging rats on set. This wasn't the exception. It was the norm. Glamour outside, filth behind. In the silent film era, Hollywood was all about speed, hygiene and safety, barely on the radar. Sets were cobbled together with reused materials, and cleanliness wasn't a priority. This chaos turned film productions into playgrounds for rats and cockroaches. These pests weren't just unwelcome. They were practically part of the crew, darting through props like they owned the place. Costumes didn't fare much better. Studios treated wardrobes like communal hand-me-downs. Cleaning them wasn't a priority. Iconic stars like Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks wore outfits that had been through multiple productions. Sweat and grime built up over time, and spot cleaning was often the best anyone could do. Under those hot stage lights, actors had no choice but to grin and bear it, literally. Makeup was another nightmare. Personal makeup kits weren't a thing yet. Everyone shared the same jars of foundation, powders, and brushes, which were rarely cleaned. Bacteria spread easily, leading to breakouts, eye infections, and irritated skin. Even stars like Greta Garbo couldn't escape these side effects. Studios provided cheap, unsanitary products, leaving actors to deal with the consequences. Sets weren't any cleaner. Outdoor shoots were often in remote locations with no running water or proper restrooms. Indoor stages were worse, poorly ventilated and stifling under harsh lights, which encouraged mold growth. Productions involving animals added another layer of filth, as their waste was rarely cleaned up promptly. Actors had no room to complain. Studio heads like Louis B. Mayer and Carl Laemmle were more concerned with meeting deadlines than health concerns. Complaints could cost you your career. The show must go on wasn't motivational. It was a thinly veiled threat. By the late 1920s, the transition to sound brought minor improvements. But sanitation was still low on the list of priorities. The glamorous image of silent films hid a much dirtier reality. Proving early Hollywood's charm had a decidedly grimy side, costume nightmares and shared wardrobes. Costumes in the 1930s and 1940s were the heart of Hollywood's magic. Stunning gowns, sharp suits, and intricate period outfits brought movies to life. But behind the scenes, wardrobe maintenance was a hygiene disaster. Studios saw costumes as investments, reusing them relentlessly with little thought to cleanliness. Even the biggest stars weren't spared. Joan Crawford and Bette Davis, icons of their time, often wore spot-cleaned outfits drenched in sweat from intense stage lights. Washing delicate fabrics like silk or sequins was considered too risky. Instead, costumes were steamed and sprayed with perfume to mask odors. This quick fix didn't remove bacteria, leaving actors stuck in musty, uncomfortable clothing. Extras had it worse. Historical epics like Gone with the Wind, 1939, required layers of elaborate costumes, corsets, petticoats, and military uniforms. These pieces were shared across productions and rarely cleaned. During Gone with the Wind, many extras suffered rashes and itching from unwashed undergarments. Studios brushed off complaints, showing how little they cared for the comfort of lower-tier workers. Animal costumes and furs were another nightmare. Popular in historical and fantasy films, they soaked up sweat and grime during long shoots. Washing them wasn't an option without ruining the material, so they turned into breeding grounds for bacteria. Actors wearing these costumes often described the smell as unbearable. Studios predictably ignored the complaints. Some stars fought back. Claudette Colbert, while filming It Happened One Night, 1934, refused to wear shared undergarments. She demanded freshly made items and used her star power to secure better treatment. Unfortunately, most actors, especially extras, lacked the clout to push for change. The lack of hygiene in costume departments was an open secret. For decades, glamorous outfits on screen hid the uncomfortable reality faced by those who wore them. It wasn't until unions began advocating for higher standards in the mid-20th century that real improvements were made. Until then, Hollywood magic came with a heavy and dirty price: makeup, mercury, and the health risks. Makeup in old Hollywood was both a blessing and a curse. It created the iconic looks that defined the era, but came with serious risks. Toxic ingredients and poor hygiene made it a health hazard for actors. The use of dangerous ingredients like lead and mercury was common. Lon Chaney, known for his roles in silent horror films like The Phantom of the Opera, 1925, relied on white face paint packed with lead. It gave him the ghostly look he needed but caused severe skin problems. Over time, the damage was permanent. Chaney, like most actors, accepted this as part of the job. Makeup tools were another issue. Brushes and sponges were shared without cleaning, making infections inevitable. Jean Harlow, the blonde bombshell of the 1930s, developed an eye infection during Dinner at 8, 1933, thanks to contaminated tools. Extras had it worse. They often used leftover products from the stars with zero regard for hygiene. One of the most shocking cases was Buddy Ebsen, cast as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, 1939. His aluminum-based makeup caused severe respiratory issues, forcing him to leave the role. Instead of addressing the safety concerns, the studio simply replaced him. Jack Haley, his replacement, was given a paste version of the makeup. While safer than powder, it still caused discomfort. The message was clear: actors were replaceable. Safety wasn't a priority. Speaking out was risky. Actors who complained were labeled difficult, which could end their careers. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that regulations began addressing these dangers. By then, many stars had already paid the price. The flawless faces of old Hollywood hit a harsh reality. Beneath the glamour was an industry willing to sacrifice its stars' health for perfection. Those shimmering eyes and perfect lips came at a far greater cost than audiences ever realized. Dark side of hair departments. Hair departments in old Hollywood had one goal: perfection. But behind the glamorous styles, hygiene and safety often took a back seat. Stylists worked tirelessly to transform actors, but their methods were far from clean. Shared tools were a constant problem. Combs, brushes, and curling irons were rarely sanitized even when used on dozens of actors. Head lice outbreaks were common, especially among extras in big productions. During Cleopatra, 1963, extras complained of itching and scalp irritation from reused wigs and hairpieces. Leading actors got slightly better treatment, but infections were still a risk. Chemical hair treatments were brutal. Actresses like Rita Hayworth endured intense processes to meet Hollywood's beauty standards. Hayworth's signature red hair required frequent bleaching, leaving her scalp raw and her hair brittle. She later admitted it was painful, but felt it was necessary to keep her career alive. Many actresses suffered in silence, knowing they had little choice. Wigs and hairpieces added to the misery. These were reused across productions with minimal cleaning. Judy Garland, while filming The Wizard of Oz, 1939, had to wear a tight wig cap to hide her natural hairline. It caused severe irritation, but her complaints were dismissed as trivial. Actors rarely had control over their hairstyles. Studios dictated every detail of their appearance. Refusing a treatment or style risked being labeled difficult, a career-ending accusation at the time. Change didn't come quickly. It wasn't until unions stepped in that hair departments began improving hygiene and safety. Before that, actors bore the brunt of unsafe practices, all in the name of looking flawless on screen. The iconic hairstyles of old Hollywood dazzled audiences, but they came at a cost. Beneath the perfectly coiffed waves and glamorous updos was an industry willing to sacrifice its stars' health for the sake of beauty, water woes, and bathing blues. In early Hollywood, basic hygiene was a luxury, especially during outdoor shoots. Clean water and proper facilities were often ignored in the rush to finish productions. Cast and crew endured uncomfortable and unsanitary conditions, though these hardships were rarely acknowledged publicly. One infamous example was the filming of Ben-Hur, 1925. Shot in the sweltering Italian desert, actors and extras spent days in heavy, unwashed costumes under relentless heat. With no proper bathing facilities, sweat and dirt built up quickly. Reports described extras developing severe rashes and infections from the combination of grime and tight garments. The studio's focus stayed on the epic chariot race scenes, offering little support to those suffering on set. Water scenes were no better. During the Ten Commandments, 1923, extras stood for hours in stagnant pools to simulate Moses parting the Red Sea. The water, filled with bacteria, led to skin infections and other health problems. Studios brushed off complaints, prioritizing dramatic visuals over worker safety. With no access to showers, actors and crew improvised. Perfumes and powders became survival tools, especially for actresses expected to look glamorous at all times. Carole Lombard, a 1930s star, was known to carry scented powders in her bag to combat the effects of long, sweaty days. Unfortunately, these quick fixes barely masked the discomfort. The lack of clean water wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Illnesses spread rapidly on crowded sets, with stomach bugs and skin infections becoming routine. Studios rarely addressed these outbreaks, leaving workers to manage on their own. Even into the 1940s, hygiene on outdoor shoots remained an afterthought. Profit and efficiency always came first. It wasn't until unions fought for better standards that portable restrooms and water stations became standard. By then, countless actors and extras had already suffered for the sake of Hollywood's grand illusions. Plight of extras and background. Extras in early Hollywood had it rough. While stars enjoyed some level of comfort, background actors were treated as disposable. These workers were essential for grand spectacles like historical epics, but faced the harshest conditions. Hygiene standards? Non-existent. Studios didn't care about their well-being. Films like Quo Vadis 1951 and Ben-Hur 1959 relied on thousands of extras. These extras spent hours crammed into poorly ventilated holding areas, often without proper restrooms or water. On Ben-Hur, reports described extras collapsing from heat exhaustion. Heavy costumes, long hours, and scorching sun made it unbearable. The studio's response? Push through to stay on schedule. The set of Spartacus, 1960, wasn't any better. Extras endured grueling shifts under blazing lights with few breaks. Clean water? Rare. Meals? Sure, but no way to wash hands before eating. Food poisoning outbreaks were common. Complaints went ignored, as deadlines always came first. Then there was the Ten Commandments, 1956. Extras playing Israelites walked barefoot across burning desert sand. Burns and blisters were inevitable, but no relief was provided. When extras protested, they were told to keep working or leave. Studios made it clear. Extras were replaceable. The inequality didn't stop there. Wardrobe departments handed extras old, unwashed costumes, while stars received fresh, tailored outfits. Makeup and hairstyling were reserved for lead actors. Extras were left to fend for themselves, highlighting the stark divide between the stars and the background players. The public never saw these struggles. Studios carefully maintained Hollywood's glamorous image, ensuring the realities faced by extras stayed hidden. It wasn't until unions stepped in during the mid-20th century that conditions improved. Extras finally gained access to clean facilities, fair treatment, and basic protections. Despite their invisibility, extras were the backbone of Hollywood's biggest productions. They filled the screens and brought epic stories to life, often at great personal cost. Pest problems on set. Pests were an ongoing nightmare on early Hollywood sets. Studios spared no expense on elaborate sets and big-budget films, but skimped on cleanliness. Rats, cockroaches, and fleas thrived, turning sets into breeding grounds for discomfort and disease. Animal-heavy productions were the worst offenders. The Big Trail, 1930, with its many livestock scenes, faced constant sanitation issues. Horses and oxen left waste everywhere, attracting flies and rodents. Cleaning crews couldn't keep up, leaving cast and crew to endure the stench and pests. Actors often worked uncomfortably close to these unsanitary conditions. Mutiny on the Bounty, 1935, was another pest-filled production. Filmed on a replica ship, the set became overrun with rats. Actors joked about their furry co-stars, but the humor wore thin when the rodents began contaminating food supplies. Their constant scurrying made scenes difficult to film and added an extra layer of frustration to an already challenging shoot. Indoor sets weren't safe either. Studios like Warner Brothers often battled cockroach infestations, especially in wardrobe storage areas. Costumes, left hanging for months between productions, became pest hotels. More than one actor found an unwelcome critter in their clothes right before filming. Fleas were another issue, especially in historical epics. Wool costumes combined with animals created the perfect storm. Extras frequently complained of itching and flea bites with little sympathy from the studios. Addressing the problem wasn't a priority. As long as filming stayed on schedule, comfort didn't matter. These infestations revealed just how little studios cared about worker health and safety. The focus stayed firmly on production deadlines. Even when actors and crew raised concerns, pest control remained an afterthought. By the mid-20th century, unions pushed for better conditions, including regular pest control on sets. But for decades, countless cast and crew members had already suffered through the itching, scratching, and outright disgust caused by Hollywood's pest problems. All for the sake of movie magic. Celebrity hygiene habits exposed. Hollywood's golden era sold perfection. Stars were glamorous, untouchable, and seemingly flawless. But behind the scenes, their hygiene habits told a very different story. Studios worked overtime to hide these quirks, preserving the illusion of untarnished beauty. Take Clark Gable, for example. Known as one of Hollywood's greatest leading men, he had a not-so-charming secret: bad breath. The culprit? Poor dental hygiene and gum disease. During Gone with the Wind, 1939, Vivien Leigh reportedly dreaded kissing scenes with him and complained about it to the crew. Still, the studio brushed off the issue to keep Gable's heartthrob image intact. Marilyn Monroe, the epitome of beauty, had her own surprising habits. She often slept in her makeup, rarely taking it off after long days. This led to frequent breakouts, requiring makeup artists to work overtime to conceal blemishes before filming. Thanks to studio-backed beauty teams, her on-screen glow remained untouched by her off-screen routines. Charlie Chaplin, known for his genius, wasn't so keen on personal grooming. He was said to skip baths during busy shoots, focusing entirely on his work. While his behind-the-scenes habits were less than pristine, audiences never saw it. His lovable tramp character stayed as charming as ever. Even Greta Garbo, a symbol of elegance, dealt with hygiene struggles. Low-quality makeup products of the time worsened her skin problems. Combined with her aversion to strict skincare routines, it wasn't an easy fix. Studios provided her with exclusive treatments to keep her screen image flawless. These anecdotes reveal the gap between Hollywood's polished image and its stars' real lives. Studios controlled every detail of public perception, ensuring audiences saw only the glamour. While these habits might seem shocking now, they remind us that even old Hollywood's icons were human. Behind the glitz, they were just people with quirks and flaws. The carefully crafted mystique kept audiences in awe, never questioning the less glamorous truths. When standards began to change. By the 1950s and 1960s, Hollywood finally started cleaning up its act. Literally, decades of unsanitary practices tolerated in the name of profit were being challenged. Unions, advocacy groups, and a growing focus on worker rights pushed studios toward change. Progress was slow, but it was significant. One big shift came in makeup departments. Shared tools like brushes, sponges, and powder jars were replaced with personal makeup kits. Artists were required to sanitize their tools and create individualized kits for each actor. This simple change dramatically reduced the skin infections and eye irritations that had plagued stars for years. Wardrobe departments followed suit. Costumes were no longer treated as sacred relics. Studios began using fabrics that could withstand regular cleaning. Disposable undergarments became standard, sparing actors the awkwardness of sharing intimate garments. Stars like Audrey Hepburn and Elizabeth Taylor used their influence to demand these upgrades, helping set a new standard for hygiene. Set facilities also improved. Portable restrooms, clean water stations, and shaded rest areas became common on outdoor shoots. Productions like Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, filmed in remote deserts, took extra steps to ensure cast and crew had access to clean and functional facilities. Conditions were far from perfect, but compared to the days of buckets and barren landscapes, it was a major step forward. Unions like the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, led the charge. SAG introduced rules requiring studios to provide sanitary conditions and protect workers' health. These new standards extended to extras and background actors, ensuring even the most overlooked workers were treated better. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Pests, illnesses, and grueling hours still tested cast and crew, but Hollywood had come a long way from its early days of filth and neglect. The reforms of the mid-20th century laid the groundwork for a cleaner, safer industry.
The year was 1943. A film sat locked in vaults too scandalous for theaters. At the center, a woman lying in hay rewriting what was allowed on screen. This wasn't Monroe or Gardner. It was Jane Russell, and her story only gets wilder from here. The bra that launched a legend. The Outlaw wasn't supposed to be a scandal. It was a low-budget Western by Howard Hughes, starring a newcomer named Jane Russell. But Hughes had something bigger in mind. He didn't just want a movie, he wanted shock value. Russell was only 21, with no major roles behind her. Hughes cast her as Rio McDonald, a sultry saloon girl. During filming, he became obsessed with how her figure appeared on screen. Costumes didn't give him the look he wanted, so he built his own solution, a new kind of bra. Metal rods, wiring, and padding were sewn into a custom design meant to lift her bust unnaturally high. Hughes even filed a patent for it. Jane hated it. "That thing hurt like hell," she said years later. "I threw it in the trash and wore my own." Despite that, Hughes told the press she wore his invention. He wanted the story to spread, and it did. Then came the haystack photo. A publicity still showed Russell reclining in hay, blouse barely holding on. No moviegoers cared about the plot. They wanted to see that image. Theaters received angry letters. Religious groups protested. One censorship board called the photo morally dangerous. The production code refused to approve the movie. Hughes had a plan. He sent fake protest letters to theaters claiming outrage from concerned citizens. It worked. Curious crowds showed up in droves. The limited release in 1943 was chaos. In New York and Los Angeles, people lined up for blocks. In some cities, police were called to manage traffic. Chicago shut the film down mid-run. Jane Russell had barely opened her mouth on screen, but her image was already burned into American culture. The Outlaw didn't make her a star because of her acting. It made her a symbol of everything Hollywood was afraid to show. The full nationwide release didn't happen until 1946. By then, she didn't need it. She was already the most talked about woman in Hollywood. And she had done it without saying a word. Headlines, contracts, and control. After The Outlaw stirred controversy in 1943, Jane Russell's name never left the papers, but behind the headlines, she was caught in a mess of studio politics, lawsuits, and image control. She hadn't asked for any of it. Howard Hughes had her locked under an exclusive contract. That meant no other studio could touch her, and she couldn't choose her roles. She later said, "I was stuck doing whatever he wanted. I couldn't even accept better parts." For years, Hughes refused to loan her out, even when major studios begged. Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount all showed interest. Hughes said no. During that time, Jane wasn't making movies. Instead, she was doing press, magazine covers, pin-up shoots, public appearances. It was all meant to keep her famous without ever stepping on set. She became one of the most photographed women in America without releasing a single new film. Then came the court battles. Film censors still tried to block the outlaw from playing nationwide. Hughes fought back with everything he had: lawyers, appeals, even threats to pull his other films from theaters. Jane stayed quiet in public, but admitted later she hated the circus. "I wanted to act, not pose for ads." In 1946, the film finally got wide release. It made millions. Critics weren't kind. Most called the acting wooden and the story dull. But it didn't matter. People came to see her. Hughes had turned Jane into a brand, not an actress. Finally, in 1947, Jane got a new project, Young Widow. It was her first non-Hughes production. The script had depth, and she was eager to prove she could act. But the damage had been done. Audiences still saw her as the hey girl. Reviews were mixed. Some praised her presence. Others said she was stiff. She later admitted she was still learning. Still, she wasn't going away. The public had decided Jane Russell was worth watching, even if no one could agree on why. For better or worse, her image had already outgrown the screen. And Hughes? He still wasn't done pulling the strings. Jane versus Hollywood. By 1948, Jane Russell was trapped between fame and frustration. She was known everywhere, but barely working. Hughes continued to control her roles and turn down outside offers. She started to push back. Hughes offered her a part in The Paleface, a comedy western with Bob Hope. Jane didn't think she could do comedy, but she said yes just to get back in front of a camera. It turned out to be a smart move. The film was a hit. Audiences loved her timing, and critics admitted she held her own next to Hope. It was the first time she got to show range. But things weren't smooth behind the scenes. Jane had no power over her career choices. Hughes micromanaged every decision. He approved costumes, scripts, even haircuts. Jane called him obsessed with control. She began quietly asking her lawyers for a way out of the contract. Meanwhile, gossip columns tracked her every move. She was photographed constantly but rarely quoted. Journalists described her as cool, hard to read, and aloof. In truth, she was tired of being treated like a mannequin. Her public image was sex symbol. In private, she was religious, blunt, and preferred quiet. In 1949, she shot The Big Steal with Robert Mitchum. The production was rushed because Mitchum had just been arrested for marijuana possession. The studio needed good press fast. Jane agreed to the project on short notice. It was a basic crime story, but again, she handled it well. Mitchum later said, "Jane was tougher than anyone gave her credit for." She wanted more like that, less glamour, more grit. But Hughes still had her locked down. In 1950, she publicly clashed with studio heads over the roles she was being offered. She turned down several scripts and refused to pose for certain publicity shots. That made her difficult in Hollywood terms. Jane wasn't playing along anymore. She wanted to act, not sell. And slowly, people were starting to listen. The pinup girl had found her voice, and she was just getting warmed up. Diamonds, Blondes, and a Stolen Show. In 1953, Jane Russell landed what should have been a supporting role. Instead, she nearly stole the film. The movie? Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Her co-star? Marilyn Monroe. Monroe played the sweet, flirty Lorelei. Jane played Dorothy, the sharp brunette who called the shots. On paper, Marilyn was the lead, but on screen, Jane dominated scene after scene. Her timing was cleaner, her delivery was drier, her attitude unshakable. Most people don't know this. Jane didn't want to do it at first. She thought the musical numbers were silly, but the studio pushed her in, and once filming started, she didn't hold back. She handled her own vocals, danced in heels, and rewrote parts of her dialogue. Monroe had more screen time, but Jane had more control. Crew members said Russell often calmed Marilyn down between takes. She reportedly helped block scenes and guided Monroe through complex shots. Then came the premiere drama. Here's the rumor. Monroe refused to attend the Blondes premiere in Hollywood, so Jane showed up alone and played both roles on the red carpet. She even signed Monroe's name for fans. Reporters called her a total pro and said she carried the night without breaking a sweat. The movie became a global hit. Jane's performance was praised for being grounded and funny, while Marilyn got the attention for her beauty. But behind the scenes, even executives said Jane held the film together. She never bragged about it. In interviews, she gave Monroe credit and avoided drama. But those who worked on the film knew the truth. Jane was the adult in the room. She showed up on time, knew her lines, and never cracked under pressure. That role cemented her as more than a body or a photo. She could act, she could command, and she could outshine a legend without even trying. Hollywood had underestimated her again, but this time everyone saw what she could really do, and Jane didn't need hay or headlines to prove it. The Hollywood Bowl baptism. In 1954, Jane Russell shocked fans again, but this time it had nothing to do with movies or costumes. She stepped into the waters of the Hollywood Bowl in front of thousands and got baptized. It wasn't a publicity stunt. Jane had always kept her faith private. She was raised in a deeply religious home and read the Bible daily. But the tension between her image and her values was growing. After years of posing in tight gowns and playing bombshell roles, she wanted to make a statement. That statement came during a Billy Graham revival event. The massive crowd watched as Jane walked into the water and was fully submerged. It made headlines the next morning. "Movie siren gets saved," one paper wrote. Others called it a mid-career pivot, but Jane didn't care. After that, she became more vocal about her beliefs. She gave interviews criticizing the moral direction of Hollywood. She said too many films celebrated sin and called some of her past work foolish. She even started a group called WAIF, World Adoption International Fund, combining her faith and advocacy. This turn confused people. She was still doing movies and still dressing glamorously, but now she was talking about Jesus on talk shows. Some fans loved it, others tuned out. The industry didn't know how to handle her shift. She didn't back down. In public speeches, she warned young actors to stay grounded and avoid the fast track to ruin. In private, she mentored struggling performers behind the scenes. But not everyone supported her. Some Hollywood insiders mocked her open faith. She was accused of being judgmental and old-fashioned. Producers called her unpredictable. Studios didn't know if she'd promote a film or preach at the premiere. Jane didn't care. She wasn't asking for approval anymore. The woman once labeled too hot for theaters was now talking about redemption and doing it on her own terms. And while the cameras rolled on others, Jane rewrote her own script in real life. Fight with the church. After several miscarriages, she decided to adopt, but adoption in the 1950s wasn't simple, especially across borders. Her first adopted son, Tommy, came from Ireland. The process took over a year. Jane grew frustrated with red tape and church politics. She believed too many kids were stuck in orphanages while paperwork dragged on. In interviews, she called the system heartless and said it cared more about rules than children. So she took matters into her own hands. In one case, she flew overseas, met with the child's caretakers, and returned with the baby before full approval. She claimed it was legal under emergency conditions. Authorities disagreed. The press labeled it baby smuggling. Jane called it saving a life. That incident pushed her to create WAIF, the World Adoption International Fund. It helped connect orphans with families worldwide. Jane used her fame to pressure lawmakers and raise money. She testified in front of Congress and worked with embassies to change regulations. But the backlash was real. Catholic leaders in Ireland accused her of undermining church-run orphanages. One priest called her reckless and self-righteous. Jane fired back, saying the church cared more about control than compassion. Despite the criticism, she expanded her work. WAIF helped place hundreds of children in homes during its peak. Jane personally reviewed applications and even helped pay travel costs for some families. She wasn't just a spokesperson, she was hands-on. This wasn't the Hollywood work people expected from a screen siren, but Jane didn't care about expectations. She said, "If I'd waited for the world's approval, I'd still be posing in hay." Her house in California became a hub for her causes. Her kids lived outside the spotlight, and she rarely talked about them publicly, but in her later interviews she called them her greatest work. The roles in film paid the bills. The work in adoption, she said, saved her soul. Russell versus feminism. In an era when women's liberation was gaining momentum, Jane took the opposite path, and she made sure everyone knew it. She called second-wave feminism a mess of angry women yelling about problems they created. In one 1,973 interview, she said, "I don't know what they're fighting for. I never had to fight for anything." That quote alone set off a storm. Talk show hosts loved booking her. She clashed with feminist guests and stood her ground, even when audiences booed. She argued that women already had power but were wasting it on resentment. "I've worked with men my whole life," she said. "I never needed to burn my bra to get respect." Her words drew backlash. Gloria Steinem's supporters called her outdated. Some women's groups urged sponsors to drop her from endorsements. But Russell didn't flinch. She said modern feminists misunderstood strength. Strength isn't about shouting. It's about knowing who you are. She also attacked Hollywood for portraying women as helpless victims or hypersexualized cliches. Ironically, critics pointed out that her early roles did exactly that. Jane didn't deny it, but said the problem wasn't the image. It was the intention behind it. By this time, she was focused on her religious activism and charity work. But her conservative takes made headlines more than her advocacy. She called Roe v. Wade a mistake and said America needed less therapy and more churches. She wasn't trying to please anyone. The feminist movement saw her as a relic. Her fans saw her as fearless. Either way, she stayed visible. While other actresses her age faded quietly, Jane Russell kept showing up, louder, bolder, and completely unwilling to change. Love her or hate her, she refused to play the part anyone handed her. At 60 and still breaking rules. In the 1980s, most actresses from Jane Russell's era were long retired. Not Jane. At 60, she signed a national ad deal to model Playtex bras. The ads ran on television, in magazines, and in stores across America. Most women her age were expected to disappear from the spotlight, but Jane showed up in full glam, pitching support bras to real women. The tagline, "Does your bra have to show your age?" Jane didn't think so. Critics rolled their eyes. She didn't care. "I wore bras before most of these ad execs were born," she joked in an interview. "I know what works." And she meant it. The campaign was a hit. Sales spiked, especially among older women who saw her as relatable, not ridiculous. But this comeback wasn't just about ads. She started making more public appearances again. Church groups, charity galas, even morning talk shows. She wasn't doing movies, but she wasn't fading away either. She found a way to stay in front of the public without pretending to be younger than she was. And she wasn't afraid to call out ageism. When a reporter asked if she'd consider a comeback film, she replied, "Sure, if they let me play a 60-year-old woman who acts like one." She also joked that it was the first time in her life people cared about her comfort more than her figure. Back then, it was all underwire and pain. Now it's all soft cups and scents. Took long enough. The lingerie campaign made headlines, not for shock, but for surprise. No one expected Jane Russell, the once silent symbol of scandal, to become the face of grown-up confidence. She wasn't trying to seduce anymore. She was trying to relate. And that hit harder than any bombshell act ever could. In a business that tossed women aside after 40, Jane Russell didn't just refuse to disappear. She came back in a bra and reminded the world who she was. And she did it with a wink, not an apology. Outspoken, unfiltered, and unbothered. While most Golden Age stars slipped into quiet retirement, Jane cranked up the volume. She gave interviews that often went viral, at least by pre-internet standards. On one local television segment, she called modern movies trash with sound effects. She criticized rising stars for acting like victims instead of women. One host tried to steer her back to polite conversation. Jane doubled down. She also leaned harder into politics. She identified as a proud conservative, supported prayer in schools, and spoke at several Republican events. She criticized Hollywood's moral decay and said most actors today were spoiled and spineless. These statements didn't win her new fans, but they kept her in the press. In 1999, she made headlines again for all the wrong reasons. She was arrested for driving under the influence in California. Her blood alcohol level was nearly twice the legal limit. At the time, she was in her late 70s. The tabloids pounced. "Busted bombshell," read one headline. She didn't deny it, she didn't spin it, and she definitely didn't apologize in public. Instead, she joked about it later, saying, "At my age, you're lucky to get a story printed about you, even if it's for drinking." Even when called out, she rarely backed down. In one interview, she admitted she didn't believe in political correctness. "I say what I mean, and if you don't like it, turn the channel." No apologies to the end. She passed away in 2011 at the age of 89. True to form, her final years were lived without filters, edits, or apologies. She spent her last decade mostly in Santa Maria, California, staying active in her church and speaking at local events. Neighbors described her as approachable but blunt. If you asked about her past, she'd answer, but she wouldn't sugarcoat it. She didn't do nostalgic interviews. She didn't attend retrospectives. When asked why she skipped award shows or tributes, she said, "I didn't go for applause when I was working. Why would I show up for it now?" In her final interviews, she remained firm in her views. She still rejected modern feminism, still criticized Hollywood's direction, and still defended her early work, even the parts people once called scandalous. "I gave the public what they wanted," she said, "and I did it on my own terms." She also spoke about faith until the end. Church was her real stage, and she liked it that way. She called it the only place that never asked me to be something else. When news of her death broke, the headlines were predictable. Most focused on the outlaw, the hay photo, and her body. Few highlighted her decades of charity work, her fights with censors, or the fact that she'd outlasted most of her peers. Her family didn't issue a long statement. They said she passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loved ones. No funeral spectacle, no red carpet send-off. And that felt right, because Jane Russell never needed the spotlight. She was the kind of star who took it, then handed it back when she was done. No legacy spin, no last-minute reinvention, just one final act of doing exactly what she always had. Living loud, aging honestly, and refusing to ever play by someone else's script.